Okay, our last speaker of the session is Yidong Xia from Idaho National Lab, and he'll be talking about some exploratory work for examining Charm++ and AMPI's suitability for his applications there.
Hello? Okay. So, my name is Yidong Xia from Idaho National Laboratory. I belong to the Department of Material Sciences and Engineering in the Energy and Environment Science and Technology Directorate. So, the reason I'm here is I have a need. And Charm++ came to my attention. I studied a little bit and feel it's very promising. That's why I came here. I want to learn more and explore more and communicate with the whole community and hoping to find an answer to solve my problems. So that's why I just given the talk of the title of the talk is the suitability of Charm++ for ExtremeScale simulations of particle-based mesoscale flow and transport phenomena. How to just go next? Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Try the down arrow here.
Okay.
Either one. Space. Yeah, okay, hang on a second. This didn't work right.
So,
Let's do
yeah.
that.
It's PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, give it a second.
Yes, just, yeah.
There you go, now it'll work.
Okay, so before I really cut into our theme, a little bit about what Idaho National Laboratory is. Because in general public, I think the INL, this lab, is less known than the rest of the peer labs because our lab has a major business and research oriented and focused on the nuclear engineering. I think that's the main reason that the public does not have much knowledge about this lab yet. So INL is in the state of Idaho, in the city of Idaho Falls, just north of Utah. And there's attraction to this area is that we are very close to two national parks, which is one is Yellowstone National Park and one is Grand Teton National Park, just 2 hours drive to either of the parks. I want to mention this just because that might be some consideration to attract some intern students if they want to take a pleasure of those national parks. That's maybe the big reason. So INL does not only operate nuclear engineering research. Although it's the major business, we also do the homeland security technology businesses and also the energy and environment research and studies. So there are a lot of interesting research, just not so widespread into the public's vision yet. So I belong to the energy and environment research group, and the research and especially simulation we have been doing, I will just show some examples on this slide. So basically, I think we have heavily been using particle-based mesoscale flow and transport modeling in our research, and we can categorize them into the Lagrange frame numerical methods and applications in energy material research. For example, you already know that some of our folks here mentioned smooth particle hydrodynamics, but their application is in astrophysics. But in general, that can be applied to many different research applications too. We also have the discrete element method, which are used to model this on solid materials too. We also have dissipative particle dynamics with the major usage to model the subcontinuous flow and transport phenomenon. And so all of the methods altogether can be considered as a very coarse-grained molecular dynamics type of methods. If people know how the general molecular dynamics work, so it's not hard for them to try to learn and understand the different higher scale methods. And one particular feature or highlight of our research is that most of our modeling and simulation work either supports or is supported by relevant laboratory experimental measurement. So what we do every day are not the pure computer scientists or the modern science. We deal with experiment scientists. All the questions we get from our modeling, the experimental peers is, can you do that? You do not have to explain to them how you do that and how big the problem is or how small problem is. The only answer they might need to know from you is that I want to set up an experiment. Can you do the equivalent and simulation to help us to validate our design, or after our experiment, can you help us do a simulation really to better look at our experimental result? If you say no, they will feel bad, you will feel bad. So you do not have to explain the challenge. You have to swallow the challenge you have and go back to your modeling peers. Okay, we have to do very large problems, but we do not know how to do that. So we have to digest a lot of a challenge and come up with the equivalent simulation capability to address those experiment problems. So here I have listed 3 applications I'm having my hands on right now. First is DM particle modeling for the bulk mass sharing test and Hopper flowability characterization. This project is mainly funded by the Bioenergy Technology Office under the EI office in DOE. Basically, the experimental guy is doing the shear testing. We do the same thing using DM modeling. And eventually, we also do the Hopper flow in a simulation environment. So each particle here consists of multiple particles in different shapes. In this particular case, you can see if we just do MPI simulation by doing the spatial decomposition, we have a very bad load balance in these problems. So actually, load imbalance exists in all the problems I will introduce. Just let me do it one by one. So that's why we need a very optimized, low load imbalanced simulation platform really to do the job. So that's why I said I have a need to come to here. So when I said extreme scale, so we need to give you numbers to indicate what extreme scale looks like in each of the different domain science problems. First here, if we are doing the equivalent laboratory scale modeling simulation, the spatial scale could be hundreds of millions of particles for simulate a shear tester or a laboratory and Hopper flow. And in terms of time scale, I think it depends on the Young's modulus. The harder the particles are, the smaller time step we have. If we use relatively soft matter, so each time step could be just 10 microseconds, and in total, maybe we need to simulate minutes or half an hour or even an hour for finishing the equivalent time that the experimental scientist would do. So, and for those problems, I think there's not only the spatial irregularity in the space where the charm plus is best at to address, also there are different force interactions between the particles, which also causes load imbalance. So this will be a perfect case in the bioenergy industry to address, to create the best performance code in order to solve the problems. And the second one is we use asphyxiation method for the oxygen diffusion and carbon oxidation in microporous nuclear graphite. If you look at the graphite material, you would think it's very tight. Actually, it's microporous. We have the tomography microscopy scientists doing the imaging for us, and we know it's really microporous. And this is a numerical model for the pore network, so we can extract from a graphite model. So the extreme scale in this particular case means trillions of particles really to create an equivalent size microcore for the experimental scientists to look at. And probably we have to use the 1 microsecond time step size, and we need to simulate the days of the physical time in order to model the actual carbon oxidation process in a microporous nuclear graphite. And although the pore network itself seems homogeneous in space, there will not be much load imbalance, but the happening of the O2 diffusion or carbon oxidation is highly heterogeneous. It can happen at just one location, and the rest of the whole domain does not have anything happening yet. So that heterogeneity of reaction will cause load imbalance in this particular case. So this is my second example. The third example is we use a DPT-based model to simulate the multi-fluid and phase flow and transport in narrow pores oil shale gas. Oil shale gas means money, so but We are doing the research for that. This is an image produced by Carl Zeiss to indicate the discreteness and complexities of poor networks in a microsample of oil shale gas. Previously, we did some research of fluid flow in such poor network, a very small sample, and we experienced the difficulty to achieve the minimum parallel efficiency on very large-scale computers just because we do not have a better strategy to address them. And there are just two-phase flows in that. So in this case, the extreme scale means, again, it could be trillions of particles to model the pore structures. And in terms of temporal scale, I think it could be 1 nanosecond to advance the time integration. And in total, we might try to look at a duration of seconds to see how the fluid flow and transport happen in this poor network. So overall, I think we are facing with the extreme scale challenges for problems of practical interest. And we would like to try to improve our modeling frameworks and the code in order to match up the need of the real challenges in this case. And here, my conclusion is the current computing capabilities for what we have are far from able to help us realize the extreme scale for material property characterizations. And that's the reason I'm trying to continually seek a solution whether we can further improve our parallel code in order to deal with the future needs. So the load balance has been identified as a major roadblock towards extreme scale simulation. And here I would like to introduce what we have already been doing. And we have been using traditional load balancing, and which are far from effective. Those are type of the scheme we can see in the general purpose simulators such as the LAMPS or Star CCM, which is commercial software. So the source of load balancing can come from different angles. And here I just list three. First is highly non-uniform transient spatial distribution of particles. It could be the heterogeneous distribution of the pore networks and something else. And it could also come from the highly non-uniform interparticle force and potential calculations. We have collisions, reactions, charging, and discharging at the different locations in space, which would cause load imbalance. And also engineered operations like slip, non-slip, wall boundary condition at some specific location, and the regional external forcing and particle addition and deletion. If you are doing the canonical molecular dynamics simulation, you want just to focus on to see how it naturally evolve. But for a lot of engineering related work, we need to add new particles or delete the particles to satisfy the setup of an engineering environment. So, and I'm taking the figures from LAMPS documentation to see, just give you a better idea. If we just do nothing, so in MPI computing, so the space is like uniformly composed, and you can see in some processors or MPI rack, there is no particle at all, which is not good for us. So there are the simple grading-based and adaptive load balancing scheme or the tiling scheme. If the spatial distribution is very non-uniform, that does not help either. And I have a quick example to see just the decomposition of two immiscible flows, how they just quickly evolve in space, and how those schemes might not be able to handle it well. I will go back to the case later on in my example. And another load balancing scheme usually used by commercial software is to decompose the simulation effort by the particle indices. If you have like 100 particles in your simulation and you're using 10 cores, maybe so each core is just distributed with like 10 particles. So it seems it's balanced, but it could be highly imbalanced by the irregular message passing patterns in the simulation. And we did the simple Hopper flow too, and with only 16 processors for strong scaling, it already dropped to 15% of parallel efficiency. And maybe in industry, a lot of people do not care about that because they do not have much larger HPC resources, and all what they have might satisfy their needs. But at the national level, we are trying to do very large-scale computing, and commercial software of what we have might not be the best choice. But in the end, for today, something like LAMPS or star CCM are still used in general. Why? Because they are so easy to use, to extend, or a lot of things, engineering purpose functions are just available. So we have to use them to quickly deliver what we have to and simulate. But in the long run, we have a strong bottleneck having the computational efficiency on large-scale computers we cannot deal with. So we must solve that. We must take the initiative to overcome the issues that we have. So I have listed a few methods, but in this presentation, I want only focus on one, which is dissipative particle dynamics, because I'm not able to introduce all the methods. So the DPD is class of coarse-grained MD model, and we just use Newton's second law for describing the governing equations. And for each particle, it has a pairwise interaction force between particles with a constant range. It could consist of three parts of a force, a random force to represent the Brownian motion, and there's a dissipative force, and there's a conservative force. And the model can be even further described as if we have the molecular dynamics model, so each molecule is precisely defined. It's called the microscopic one. But if we use DPD model, so each DPD particle can be considered a cluster of molecules, which is so-called coarse-grained. So at a higher level, we can consider about the SPH model or even the traditional CFD model as finite volume or finite element, whatever. So why we are considering this DPD model for flow simulation, there's a reason, let me tell you. And currently we are using so-called many-body DPD for simulating the multi-phase flow. And in this case, I would explain why it's not the Navier-Stokes equations with volume fluid for doing the two-phase flow. Just look at this. If we are looking at like the fluid flow in a very narrow pore, the nanometer scale, in this case, 2 nanometers wide. So between the two fluids, there are a lot of random and fluctuation and diffusion between those fluids, which cannot be described by a continuum model. But if we look at the microscale pore, which is 100 nanometers wide, you can see a very clear interface between the two fluids, which can be oil and water. There is a perfect, relatively stable and contact angle. So Navier-Stokes equations and or the associated traditional CFD model cannot be used to model subcontinuum fluid flow, which is the reason we are trying to use the so-called mesoscale model for fluid and flow. And I have manually created a few benchmark test cases to see how good or bad the current codes we are using are. Actually, the first is the liquid vapor interface at the nanoscale. So there are two interesting cases. One is we have a liquid drop surrounded by the steam vapor particles. And the second one is we have a pure liquid drop in space. For this simple simulation, actually, I have used 4 million particles, a whole lot. And you can see in this particular case, there are a sparse particle distribution around this drop, the water drop. If we are doing nothing in MPI computing, you can see the spatial decomposition will give us the very bad the performance just because the communication is not optimized. And in another case where we have the pure water job, I think most of the MPI ranks are empty. There's nothing, no computing in there. So there will be high MPI waiting time for this particular case. So then we apply the so-called RCB, just a tiling method to really adjust the spatial distribution of the ranks. So that can help a lot to further help us to optimize the performance of parallel efficiency in each case. However, even we are doing so for strong scaling problems, the parallel efficiency will continuously drop if we increase the number of nodes. And we are hoping to have a better model, especially when we can overlap the communication and the force computing in order to maintain the strong scalability on the very large size of the HPC. So this is one example where we have the relatively static and irregular distribution of space, because once this problem comes to an equilibrium status, at least, and nothing significantly will change in space in terms of the computing load. The second example is a fast transient problem. Actually, in this problem,
Ask a quick question.
yes, please.
Did you do MPI plus OpenMP for that?
For each case, actually, on top of lamps, I also did the like MPI plus X approach, where I used pure OpenMP within one node and used multiple node and with an OpenMP. I actually did that for those cases. But I forgot to mention that for doing so, actually, I did not get any significant reward. And there is a reason. I believe the reason is that the programming paradigm developed in lamps in order to allow us to use OpenMP on top of MPI is not optimized. It is far from optimized because the original developer has to put a balance between how much extra effort a user has to program and how easy it could be programmed. So eventually he chooses that, and it does not put too much burden on the users to develop their OpenMP code. That's the reason that they are not using the so optimum way of OpenMP implementation on top of lamps. So I can understand that. Otherwise, will be terrible. Because later on, I will tell you my story of learning Caucus on top of lamps, and I gave up after two weeks actually. But the OpenMP implementation is still something well durable, just does not give me the performance I wanted. So in this example, manually, I just clustered the water particles and the oil particles. You know, water and oil are two immiscible fluids. They cannot be really mixed. So once we can mix them in a simulation environment, they will detach. They will detach to repel each other. So this is the simulation manually created in order to create a strong load imbalance to see how crazy things going on. So for each fluid, there are 2 million particles, and because of they are forcefully clustered. Once my simulation started, they try to just burst out in all the directions. So this case will cause a very bad load imbalance example, actually, just in order to show how well we can take care of those problems. I would say, and within the available options we have, still MPI plus some adaptive domain partition is the best option that we have so far. In this particular case, I didn't bother to do the parallel efficiency indication. I just wanted to show if we keep using more MPI cores and how much time we can reduce, and we can see if we over 500 cores, if we just add more core onto that, it will still reduce time, but it's not promising, but it's tending to flatten out eventually just because a lot of overhead in this province. So that's another reason I'm looking at the Chunk Plus and the AMPI for dealing with such challenging ones. Actually, they're not challenging at all out of all of my applications, because like 4 million particles in a simulation is just a tiny problem yet, actually. So this is a problem of practical interest, flow and transport in narrow parse shell. So this is a high resolution image of how shale rock looks like under your microscopy. So the shale has the multiphysics problem in nature, and there are multi-scale pore networks starting from the micrometer from the nanometer to the micrometer. And the common belief is that the oil is contained in the organic matter hosted pores. So we have different type of pores. It could be pores hosted in non-organic matter, just like the minerals and clays. There are also pores in the organic matters. The constitutes of those shales very complicated. So the oil and the gas companies know how to really use force, use water to fracture them, to extract the oil. But the thing is that the scientific understanding how fluid flow in shale largely lags behind our recent advances in shale and gas production. You know, we only focus on how to really revenue on those materials, but how much actually we can do with them is really a big question mark, and nobody in the industry really cares about that. As a scientist, we care about how the fluid dynamics looks like in those complex environments. And I previously did some initial attempt of direct flow model in non-repulsed shell, where we just use the 3D voxels we get from image scientists to build up our DPT modeling for fluid flow in such very tiny problems. Actually, for this tiny structure, I asked a student back in University of Utah to produce many samples. So at the 5th sample, I eventually said, yes, this is the sample I wanted. Actually, it took him 5 nights actually to produce quite a few samples. So without the experimental scientists, our modeling cannot happen. Just I want to give credit to those experimental scientists. Without them, actually, so-called practical problems, we cannot address them in modeling simulation. And there are just some time evolution of like the water flooding into a fully saturated and pore network looks like. And it's a very preliminary study, and we want to do a very large case. So this is an ongoing effort. We are looking at the so-called extreme. What is extremes means, so we are looking at this organic matter hosted pores in a shell sample from Argentina, so which I got from experimental science from Carl Zeill, Microscopy Inc. So all of those structures you're looking at are actually the organic hosted pores, which in other way we can consider they contain the oil. But they are quite discrete in space and they have a very low permeability. If we give a statistic representation, we can see all of those pore spaces account for only 2% in this big block. So, and we also want to look at the even details how fluid flow can happen within these pores. So I extracted each independent pore networks to just demonstrate how complex and how heterogeneous of their distribution in space, because those distributions themselves could cause load imbalance if we use just the standard MPI computation. So I have to estimate the computational burdens. If we are looking at this pore structure, which a rough estimation is that it could contain 500 millions of fluid and solid parts combined. If I wanted to reach a steady state by flow injection, it could cost me hundreds of millions of time steps to reach a steady state and do like the material characterization just to calculate what the permeability of this sample is. So in order to do some demo, I needed to crop down the computation size. Then I'm looking at a smaller subdomain, which might be 90 million particles. It almost eat away my 1 terabyte personal computer. So I decided not to use this for a demo simulation. I even cropped it down to a 10 million example, which is already very simple, but this way I can afford to show you at least before I can get any better results. So this is just a toy problem, a tiny toy problem. I have like 10 million particles in this ridiculously simple problems, but there are 10 million particles. And it cost me 2.7 million time steps to show you this example. So this is actually a highly engineered process. In order to inject the fluid, the external flow in a saturated pore network, you need an artificial and solid slab with a higher pushing force. But in reality, the fluid in a rock cannot be easily pulled by you because there could be the back pressure to push back. So I needed to create such a slab too to give a lower force as the back pressure. So for this particular case, let's see where the load imbalance can come from. First, by adding additional force in these 2 particular slabs, we are causing load imbalance. And also, we have a much dense particles of the injection flow and the relatively sparse distribution of fluid in this pore space. There is a spatial heterogeneity. There, again, it will cause load imbalance. So, and also, it's a dynamic problem. It's a transient problem. Once the more particles flow into different locations, if we are using the standard MPI by domain decomposition, the each MPI rank is distributed a highly different number of particles and force calculations, which is a very bad case for load balancing. So I hope this simulation test case can give you a rough idea what my challenge is while I'm looking at this Chomp++. So there's an additional case because when I look at the previous applications of Chomp+, there are the, like hydraulic fraction examples using some finite element type method, but using particles, DM parts, we can also do the same thing. Hydraulic fraction actually is a multi-physics problems. For fluid flow, in this case, we are using finite volume mesh-based models. For the particle fracturing, we're using the discrete element flows. So the load imbalance in this problem can be obviously seen where the fraction happens. There are more computation, then those are not fractured. So a lot of interesting cases happening in our group dealing with load imbalance. So some lessons. I'm trying to really identify some model which can help me to pursue the extreme scale. So suitabilities of a few options are evaluated, and my personal thoughts are given below. The caucus is something that like I've known in early stage, which is primarily developed at the San Diego National Lab. It's so-called performance portable programming. But I think eventually I found out that the design not directly devoted to addressing the load imbalance. It's just really, the highlight is so-called performance portable programming. You write it in his syntax, and it can be compiled into CUDA code or OpenMP code or KNL code. It's just straightforward. You do not need to write multiple code to address like different HPC architectures. But my personal feeling is it lacks up-to-date full detailed documentation and advanced tutorials, which makes the learning curve really difficult. My own example is I tried to learn a little bit of the LAMPS caucus implementation, but a lot of the code implementations in the particular version the syntax are not really documented in their user manual, which is really frustrating as like the individual learners as me. So I think I'm not able to work on that by myself by reading over the documentations. You must stay in the same lab with the San Diego guys. That might be the only way you can make a progress, which is quite affordable by general users. The second one is GROMACS. GROMACS is very famous in those bio modern simulation. It has a fine-grained multi-level parallelism and the best possible adaptive domain decomposition for load balancing. However, as said in its own user manual, the load balance is not good if particle spatial distribution is too irregular. So it says it cannot address that problem. So, and also the code structure not designed to serve general purpose engineering needs, such as extension to take the huge effort, which usually cannot afforded by students. And eventually, I'm looking at Chomp++ and AMPI. Automatic load balancing by over decomposition and smart rack staggering just sounds very interesting to us. Although it's not the only one with this philosophy, but everyone agrees that it's the most mature and dedicated so far. And through the past days, I really found it's not hyper difficult to learn. You need effort, and you can learn it. My personal comment, it's not like this without help, I cannot learn at all. So that's the difference. And, but something that we want but not there yet is no general purpose particle simulations on Chomp++. I think it's indeed a job for MBD scientists. It's not for the Chomp++ team yet. And also what concerns me is the length of the R&D cycle, because many forms of lab funding lifespan at INL, maybe at some other national labs, are not so long. We may have the 3 to 5 years of cycle, and if we are dealing with experimental scientists, we must deliver something very visible to them. Otherwise, we cannot really get the continuing funding for them, because what they need is actual simulation results, but not your code itself. So we are under multilateral pressures to move on with our computation challenges. But I think there is a lot of reasons we should at least look at the Charm Plus and AMPI platform to give some preliminary code development and showcase to see whether we can move forward with this particular platform. We need to convince a lot of people who are not doing simulation, actually, so in the real world. So there's a very draft pathway to ExtremeScale using the Charm Plus. The personal view is that optimum Charm Plus implementation of lamps like general purpose simulator is not trivial at all. Great effort. But the current goal is we want to move forward with quick proof concept and the development of some mini codes. The first type of thing is that using existing MP code, maybe just do some modification on top of AMPI. And for our particular applications, we will see, yes, how good it is. And also we could do the native implementation of a Charm Plus with some mini code to see how great or it is. In the long term, we want to target at general purpose particles with such a big frame because we are dealing with general purpose needs. So that's so much I can introduce so far, and we have great work to do for the upcoming next year. I hope I can come back next year at the workshop with some progress, as real progress again. So there's a glance of the HPC we have. So the time's almost there, so I want to expand it more. We have trying to build up collaborations with all different angles in this nation, trying to build up the applications. The computer scientists at IBM, the multi-physics methods group at Brown Universities, at UIUC Charm Plus, and the digital micro imaging programs too. So this research is funded by INL's IODRD program, and also we use Oak Ridge's computing resource for part of our research. And last, welcome to INL for a visit if it's possible for you. Thanks so much for your attention. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share my experience with you. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions before going to break.
Very good talk. I wish we were not so far behind, but this is excellent, and I think this will be the kind of thing that we would like to explore together. We would be happy to help in any which way we can, because we need Charm++ can do load balancing, has these capabilities inside the runtime system in adaptive MPI as well, but we are not domain experts. In retrospect, it seems to me like taking lamps and running this coarse grain mesoscale model with some particle exercises should have been something that we should have just done. But we don't know enough about it to set the problems and do it. So it will be great to collaborate and work with you. And first on the simpler objectives that you outlined, maybe just the lamps, AMPI or something, and then later on to build a framework that you're interested in. I think it's an excellent prospect.
Okay, really appreciate it.
Other questions? Let's thank the speaker again.
Okay, thank you.